pile of books over there, and I know there's quite a few more. Diana and books, they kind of go hand in hand in my mind.
Yes.
Let's thank Vera Cruz for the lunch today. Yay, it's always my favorite, one of my favorite lunches. That bean cheese enchilada casserole. It lives in my memory. I really like that. Sorry, folks online. It's really good, and we can't wait to be in the room with you and all eat together. But you know, it's that COVID kind of thing going on. So everyone's taking the precautions they need to. I'm glad of that. Everyone stay well, stay safe. Even when we're going about our volunteer work, let's make sure that we're doing what needs to be done to protect ourselves and protect the people that we're going to be visiting. And going forward, thinking of this COVID line of thought, has everyone seen the $1,000 that's available for young adult pandemic aid? We've got that email out circulating. The end date is the 15th. It seems to be a very simple process for these folks to fill out. And it's pretty much a string-free $1,000 to help them in whatever they may need in life right now. So if you know anybody 18 plus who's aged out of the foster care system, this is geared for them. And we want to make sure that we take every dollar off the table. So if you know of anybody that would fit the bill, share the information with them. We'd like to see that happen. Hey, Timmy, come on in.
I've had somebody apply for that already.
Oh, you had already? Great, great. It seems like it's a very simple process. You don't have to keep receipts. You don't have to spend it on certain things. And it's always helpful. Yeah, Christine.
Do they have to be still in CPS adult living?
It's if it's extended care, I think that might work.
I thought they had to.
No, they don't have to be extended.
Oh.
It's up to the age of 26
Oh,
that they can apply for this young adult pandemic aid. So I'm just really kind of hoping that we access that. That can be very helpful for some kids. With the September trainings already been mentioned, it's on the 14th, 16th, 21st, and 23rd. It's going to be virtual again, with our pandemic kind of theme this year, unfortunately, sorry. But we're looking forward to getting some more volunteers in, because looking at the numbers, we have right now 46 children that haven't a volunteer. So we're really looking forward to making sure that those kids, those families have a CASA volunteer to work with. So if you're working one case and you feel like you might want to take on another, reach out to Morgan. And also, if you know of anybody who's interested in taking on our training in September, we're going to do it again in October. We hope that you'll access that. We really do need you to come help these kids and their families. And thinking of that, we just swore in 3 people. I see they're not here, but maybe they're online. Shimri Breeze, Courtney Heinel, and Angela Pavlaka. Thank you all for getting sworn in last Friday. And I believe tomorrow we're going to get Lisa Cox sworn in. Is that right?
Lisa and Kelly.
Lisa and Kelly, great, Kelly Slaughter. And then we have Norma Alvarado, who's still in training, but looking forward to coming through. So we've got some new volunteers, and when you get to meet them, please say hi, let them know how it goes. And also want to thank the folks who closed cases in August. Well, 19 children left our care, foster care, and of those 19, 13 of those children were placed with their parents or with their family. And the other 6 were adopted by non-relatives. And I'd like to do a little shout out to Brandy Davis, Kim Taylor, Cindy Chamberlain, Kay Gregston, Beverly Cheshire, Beth Knie, Willie Mae Ford, Melissa Neubauer, Karen Gregory, Marla Darlick, Shelley Severland, Esther Mitchell, and Linda Owens for closing those cases. Thank you all. And you've all been busy in August. You know, I count numbers a lot. That's what I usually do, count. And you all donated 286 volunteer hours this month. And you drove over 3,151 miles. Thank you all for that dedication to CASA's mission, visiting with children and family, be it in person or virtually. Thank you for keeping those connections and meeting with everyone that needs to be met with to make sure that its children and family get the help that they need. And to learn more, it's my pleasure to get to introduce our speaker who's going to talk about suicide prevention. And I know him from UHB, but he is in his Gulf Bend role. And I think we have a real resource in training coming up with UHB, and Dr. Albrin Rodriguez is going to be our contact person for that. So thank you, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, I bet you didn't think you were going to have enchiladas and talk about suicide today. So we'll talk about it. So yeah, so I don't typically, usually I typically work from a PowerPoint, but I have some technical difficulties. So I'm just going to work from a PDF format. Can y'all hear me pretty clear? Can y'all hear me pretty clearly? Okay, cool. I used to be a drum major in high school, and so I got the volume thing on lock. But if you don't hear me, just let me know, and I'll try to speak louder. So as the speakers have been addressing you, my heart's just been just pumping with just peace and joy. And I recognize the work that you do as volunteers, whatever capacity you work in CASA with. I just want you to know, if no one has told you, that your contribution to society is something to be recognized and to be awarded. So let me just start off by saying that if it wasn't for the work that you do, our society would be a different place. It really would. And so just a little bit about myself. Like Tim said, I am an outreach specialist with Gulf Bend. I'm also a counselor educator. I'm an assistant professor of professional counseling at UHB. So I'm kind of like just working from both roles, but I'm here today representing Gulf Bend as the outreach specialist. And part of my job is to essentially do what I'm doing right now, which is to go out to the community and talk about mental health. So we just experienced, we're in the midst of a world pandemic, right? So automatically I'm thinking about words like fatigue, compassion fatigue. We're talking about wellness and being tired, right? Like those concepts, I think if we're in the trenches, like I consider you guys are in the trenches, right? It's easy to forget about things like personal wellness, right? It's easy to forget things about concepts like suicide awareness. And so part of my job really is just to come out to the community and gently remind you about things that you already know, right? But perhaps I could present it in a way that will refresh what you know and how you practice strategy and prevention and intervention. So today is a really tough topic. I'm going to talk, I mean, it's September, so it's Suicide Awareness Month. I think we would all agree that everyone has a different understanding of what suicide is based on our personal life experiences with it, perhaps, right? We've perhaps have had students. I've had students. I come from the public school realm. I've had students that have unfortunately have taken their life, you know. I know adults that have completed suicide. And so I'm sure as human beings, you have family members that have suffered from symptomology of mental health and have convinced themselves that completing a suicide was the only way out, right? And so what I'm going to offer you today is just a refresher of some symptomology that we could see, some resources perhaps. My goal really is to dispel the stigma that goes behind talking about something like suicide, because I think a lot of us are scared to even talk about it, right? Raise your hand if you are aware of the perception or are tempted to be fearful of talking about suicide because you're scared that you might put it in someone's head. Well, you guys are trained very well, but let me just say, most people are scared to talk about it because of that misconception. There's a misconception that, oh, if I mention suicide to someone, if they're not thinking about it, they're going to definitely be thinking about it after I say something. The truth of the matter is we need to talk about it. We need to talk about it because there's people thinking about it, right? So it helps to talk about it. So today, let's see if I can do this because I haven't worked in a PDF in a long time. I'm just going to give you a couple of notes on the wording because words matter these days, right? So some definitions to use, some different terms to think about. I'll go over a couple of statistics. I'm not going to bore y'all with research because I see that y'all are enjoying your enchiladas and I do not want to like be a downer for you. But we're going to go over some statistics. We'll talk a little bit about risk factors for suicide. We'll talk a little bit about the warning signs and what you could do. So as a show of hands, and I'm new to Victoria, and when I say new, I mean 2 years, but one of those years was during the world pandemic, so really 1 year. Right when I just started going to like restaurants here, the world pandemic hit, and I'm like, oh. So, okay, so raise your hand if you primarily only work with children and adolescents. Okay, so what's the age range of the clientele here? Is it children? Is it just children and adolescents? Up to teens? Okay, cool. Okay, so a lot of this information is going to apply to you. So a little bit about my background. I'm a professional school counselor. I'm a certified school counselor. I'm also a licensed professional counselor in Texas. So I come from the school world. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is stuff that I hands-on have dealt with myself. I have had to assess students that had suicide ideation. And then as I grew in the profession, I had to assess adults, right? So adults that had bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, personality disorders that truly lent themselves to, displaying the symptomology. So I've had to have these really tough discussions. And so a lot of what I'm going to present to you today is based off of my experience with that. So a little bit about myself. I'm an outreach specialist. I'm a licensed professional counselor in OPC. I'm a counselor educator. I have a PhD in counselor education. So this is what I do all day, every day, is teach mental health, and I love it. And so this is me in a nutshell. So let's talk about words, because again, I want to be mindful of time. But let's talk about some words. People do not commit suicide. For a very long time in the mental health field, this term has been used over and over and over again, that, oh, so-and-so unfortunately committed suicide. They committed suicide. Oh, they've tried to commit suicide. It's not the best terminology for us to use, right? So for example, if you think about a criminal, right? Someone commits a crime, right? They committed the crime, right? Someone has been committed to a psychiatric institution, right? So that's the correct terminology. But when it comes to suicide, it's not about someone's commitment to the action, right? It's not, because think about what we're saying if someone does not complete suicide. If someone attempts suicide and they don't complete it, by using the term commit, what we're saying is, oh, you did not commit enough to complete suicide. So we're kind of just, we're adding salt to a wound that's already there and that's deep. So we want to avoid as best as we can the term commit, right? So some terms that you can use instead is someone has suicided or someone has died by suicide, right? Any comments or questions?
I've heard a lot of people say completed instead of committed. Is that basically the same thing, or would that be an alternate?
It's more appropriate to say completed, yeah. So you can say completed.
And then the phrase, attempt suicide?
An attempt, yeah, that's acceptable, yeah. It's just the word commit. That means that this person has total control over the action, which we all know, sometimes they don't, right? Suicide assumes that the person, at least from the mental health field, assumes that the person literally has no way out, and their thought is, this is my only way out. That to me doesn't sound like someone has it, it doesn't sound to me that they believe they have a choice. A commitment is a choice. So, you were gonna ask something else?
Yeah, when I worked in Dearborn, you like to use the word, like you said, it's words that have consequences, and it's not too much as a party says, what you say. Actually, when you say something, you know what you mean, but the person does not understand exactly what you're trying to get over. So if I'm attempt to, does that give you the power to go ahead on and commit that action that you thought about? Or do I have to think about that again? It's like, okay, well, I got to think, am I going to do this this way? Do it better? Or do I not do this at all? And what is my option to that?
Yeah, and you're pointing to a very key thing, which is how the person feels, how they feel, because it's not really about our understanding. At the end of the day, it's not about what we think about suicide. It's not about the skills and techniques that we use. It really is about the experience of your client or your case, right? It's about their experience. Most people that attempt suicide and die by suicide feel like that is the only way out. This is my answer, right? This is how the pain stops. We all know that suicide is a permanent, so it's a permanent ending, right? It's a permanent solution to a temporary issue, right? Now, that's not always the case, right? There are some cases where it's, life is just really, really hard, and we understand. I think as people that work in the field, we understand that pain. What we may not understand is why people are driven to feel that this is the only way out, right? And so this is part of our jobs now, right? Is to educate ourselves, to continue learning. And so hopefully this has, if you didn't already know it, hopefully this has reminded you that words matter. And sometimes you'll be able to gauge it with your clientele, be able to use certain words and see if they connect with certain words. But for the most part, we want to avoid saying commit. So some definitions: suicide is the intentional taking of one's own life, right? It's an intention. Suicidal ideation is a term used for suicidal thoughts, right? So not necessarily the action, but suicidal thoughts. And then we have parasuicide, which is a suicide attempt that is designed to fail or be discovered, right? A lot of times people in the trenches that are change agents, either counselors, school counselors, caseworkers, we come across these clients that attempt suicide, luckily do not complete it. And then we kind of find out through the lines that, well, perhaps there's a temptation of, well, perhaps this client was one intention, right?
But it's not just the thought that they start, but the thought, the suicide,
What was that? Can you ask that again?
the thought,
Yeah.
just the thinking.
Yeah, if it's just the thought, then that's suicidal ideation. If they're thinking it and they attempt a suicide with the intention of not really completing it, right? That's parasuicide.
Would that be like, we have incident reports, sometimes it'll say, superficial wounds, like the scratch, on the wrist or the fight, so would that fall under parasuicide?
Yes, it depends if the client is saying words. So if they give you the signs that it's the traditional pathway to suicide, for example, you see they give you a reasonable, they give you this, this is I come from the school counseling realm, and I always have issues talking about this specific part because of the ideology of, well, are people doing it for attention? If they really don't want to commit suicide, or they don't want to die by suicide, then are the signs that they're displaying, is that for show? And so it's a big paradigm shift, because if someone comes to you and they have some scars, obviously they're self-harming, obviously they're giving you signs that they're considering perhaps ending their life. But if they don't have the intention to take their own life, then perhaps this is what we're talking about.
And I
Right.
think that's the thing, I was volunteer for a long time, I've been a supervisor for 4 years, so I've had a lot of children, and so I need to know how to talk about that with my volunteers, and then so the volunteers kind of know how to approach it, because I don't know what the right way to say. I mean, I'm aware of died by suicide. My sister does suicide prevention awareness, and so she's always, in our heads with it. But using the appropriate words is so important that I need to know the words. I don't want to say, like when they call it superficial wounds, should we call them superficial wounds, or does that downplay?
I think it does. I personally feel like it does downplay. So my own vocabulary includes these three terms: right? So instead of saying superficial, I would say, oh, that they're displaying parasuicidal behavior, right? So instead of saying, this child is cutting themselves, it's very superficial. They're not really going to attempt suicide. What we needed to start saying is they're displaying parasuicidal behavior, and they're at risk for potentially attempting suicide, right? So that might be, and like I said, this is a paradigm shift because for many years, I would say the last 40 years, in public schools, that's the language that has been used, right? So we all know, we all come from the school system, we all know back in the day when someone died by suicide, they used words like committed, they committed suicide, which automatically says, oh, this person had a choice. Well, sometimes they don't, but it's all about being on a spectrum, right? And so what I'm saying is on one side of the spectrum, we have suicide where they take their own life. In the middle, we have suicidal ideation. And then on the far end, we have individuals that have some suicidal ideation. And they're somewhat, they're exploring suicide by being parasuicidal, right?
Because I'm just trying to take the words that I, out of my vocabulary that I've used for all these years and make sure that I'm using the right ones. And that's one thing
Absolutely.
from psychiatric facilities and RTCs and things like that. And they use the term superficial, I mean, that's the only
Yeah.
reason why I do that.
Whether it's superficial or the level of superficiality really doesn't matter. Does that make, so at the end of the day, this person is considering suicide, right? At the end of the day. That's a great question, great term.
You said it really doesn't matter when you use the word superficial, whatever, and I kind of disagree with that.
Okay.
Because when you say it doesn't matter and they continue to use that, when you say superficial, then that means there's a roadmap that that person that's doing that is giving you signs. And we have to understand, try to be able to recognize that those signs that are coming to try to do some intervention before it gets to that point. If I'm hurting myself, it's a cry out for help.
Yeah,
So-
let me clarify. So I come from, in my profession, whether it's a superficial action, I still have to treat it as if it was not superficial. So I guess I have to clarify that assumption, is that no matter what the severity is, which is what I'm trying to say, it doesn't matter what the severity of the outcry is, it still warrants intervention. And so we just got to be careful with being too laxed on assessing, because I mean, in school counseling, I would say maybe 75% of the outcries that I got were technically what people would consider superficial. Although that didn't stop me from assessing them for suicide, right? But there are some cases out there that I think people, especially if you work in the type of work that you do, it's sometimes easy to get fatigued, right? It's easy to just be so drowned by your cases that sometimes you look at a case and it might be superficial, and then we'll kind of be tempted to, okay, well, I'm not going to do a full assessment, right? And so I'm just being real with y'all, because this is what we experience in the counseling world as well.
We have to understand that too, because sometimes we can just miss something.
Yep.
Like you say, we get caught with so much, and we are just didn't see that. And when something happens, God, how did I miss
How
that?
did I miss?
You're only human.
And it happens,
Yeah,
and
it does.
yeah, and you're right, we are human. And so a part of this is just a refresher of the importance of using words and maybe shifting the paradigm of thinking just a little bit, right? So, yes.
I think I have about 3 questions in one, but so I'm trying to speed it up the best I can.
Okay.
Okay, what happens, how do you treat issue or situation when someone comes to you and they tell you, you're picking up something that's maybe superficial or not, and then you find out, you're talking to them and they go behind dresser behind their jewelry box, and they said, well, I have a knife here, you know, I've had it here for 3 days, you know, whatever and stuff, and so if we get to talk to someone, they'll bring it back.
Yeah, absolutely. So in, and so this type, a suicide assessment is probably its own training, which maybe I could come and do again, or do on a separate time, but are y'all trained with suicide assessment here?
Well, not here, but when I worked at Devereaux.
Okay.
We
Okay.
had to go to that every year. all the time.
Okay. So to answer your question, there's a very clear protocol when assessing suicide ideation, right? At the very basis of it, it's asking someone if they've ever thought about suicide. If they say yes, and you wouldn't just ask it like that. You wouldn't just say, have you ever thought about suicide? You would ask it in a different way. You would ask, have you ever thought about harming yourself? Okay, the answer is yes. Then you get into assessing the level of harm. Well, how would you hurt yourself if you did? Well, I would get a razor and I would hurt my wrist, or I'd lose myself. That is different than I'm gonna walk into my room, get a gun, and shoot myself in the face. You could see that the level of severity is different, right? So the number one thing that you gotta think about is if the client that's sitting in front of you has a very clear path to a weapon or to attempting and completing a suicide, then that's a really high risk, you know? So if it was me, if they knew where the knife was, then that would be considered a high risk. You know? Or if they have access to a weapon, which most people do, right? Most people have access to a kitchen where there's weapons, right? So if you ask a client and if you ask them what their plan is, which again, it's scary to do, but this will give you a lot of information. If they detail their plan, then they're at risk. They are at a really high level of suicide. So Tim, that's probably another training we got to do. Yeah.
There's a comment from one of our online volunteers. She says perhaps the change we should make is not to condemn attention seeking, but to see it as a call for help restraint.
Absolutely. And that's why I say some people are considering suicide. So when I had students that came to my office or children that came to my office that were cutting, right? The term cutting is there's a lot of stigma behind it. And because it's thrown around so much in schools, I think people forget the severity of it. But cutting to me, or any type of self-harm behavior, whether it's punching themselves or starving themselves, whatever, they are flirting with the idea of suicide. They are thinking about it. And so I think if we think about it in the terms of proximity, okay, this person technically has what we consider superficial cuts. At the end of the day, they are flirting with the idea of suicide. They're flirting with this idea of harming themselves enough to end their life. Because then there's other, I'm gonna answer your question. There's other things that also involved. There's also addiction. So a lot of people don't realize this, but cutting, self-harm, any type of self-harm can also develop into an addiction. And once that happens, it's pretty dangerous. So, yes, ma'am.
You that all people that have suicidal ideation give out advice or help, because I personally knew someone that died by suicide. But he didn't. There were no signs. I mean, we talked a lot, and he was a total opposite, just happy and.
Yeah.
So I mean.
You know, I really don't think there's a completely bulletproof answer to that. You know, I think there are some people that that have decided in their mind that they want to end their life. So when I was in my training, for example, one of the things when I was learning about suicide, one of the things that blew my mind about this topic was that you could have someone who demonstrates the symptomology of depression, for example, right? They could be battling through depression for so long, right? And you could see it in their life. You could see it on their face. You could see it in the way they speak. And then from one day to the next, they're super happy. So what does that tell you? If there's this happiness based on from day one, one day they're they're depressed, and you see all this symptomology, and then the next day they're super happy. That's a major shift in their character, right? What I have found and what I've learned is there's some individuals that in their midst of pain, they decide that they're going to end their lives. So that brings them comfort, right? That blew my mind, because when you think about individuals that attempt suicide or die by suicide, we tend to put them in this box of, oh, they need to show this symptomology. The answer to your question is not everyone shows signs, right? And so there's an element of this work that we do that also depends on the rapport that we build, right? From human to human. I pray that this person feels comfortable enough with me that they would let me know that something's going on. At the end of the day, we can't save everyone, right? We could just become skilled and learn what we need to learn to be able to at least lower the number, right? And to be there for people. And the reason why I started this talk with affirming the work that you do is because a lot of times case managers are the ones that hear the cries, right? But I also want you to know that if you don't hear the cry and something happens, it's not your fault, right? You are not in your position as a volunteer to be someone's savior. I'm not as a counselor, right? But what we can do is help each other.
It's easy said than done.
So I'm going to talk about this at the end of the presentation, but there's also this concept of taking care of yourself, right? We as first responders have to we have to be able to take care of ourselves before we take care of others, right? And for some people, that's a really hard concept to understand. But we have to think about what's best for other people, what's best for ourselves. And this is a really tough subject. Suicide in the counseling profession is really tough. I mean, I've had clients that have ended their life. I haven't had many, I've had 2. And let me tell you, it made me question whether I was built for this profession, right? But it's part of the profession. It's part of the career. And so I guess I want you to remember too that it's very easy to get enmeshed with your clients and your cases like lives to the point where you start losing your own. And let me tell you, what your clients really need is for someone to be solid and to be strong and to be that voice of reason, right? That doesn't mean that you got to have perfect lives. That doesn't mean that your mental health has to be perfect, right? There isn't anyone in this room that has perfect mental health, me included, right? So I'll be the first one to say that. But it's really important that we understand we at the end of the day, we could help someone think differently. We could offer suggestions, but it's going to be the rapport building that is going to be important, right? And making someone feel valued and cared for. So any comments and questions? So some suicide statistics. Suicide was the 10th leading cause of death overall in the United States. This is actually a good statistic because it has lowered. It used to be the 2nd leading death for many years. But so apparently the health professions are doing something right. But still, that's a very high statistic. So it's the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. It's the 2nd leading cause of death among people between 10 and 34 years of age, right? So there were nearly 2.5 times many suicides as there were homicides. And so that's a pretty alarming statistic in the United States. So any comments and questions about statistics? Okay, some risk factors for suicide. Obviously, mental health plays a really big role. Mental health, financial difficulties. So we tend to, in the helping professions, we tend to just blame everything on the mental health. Well, our lives are not just about the mental health, right? We have financial health, we have spiritual health, we have social health. We have all these parts of our, Cindy knows this, we have all these parts of the wellness wheel, right? We're not just about mental health. We have intellectual, we have our social, we have our interrelationship parts of us. So financial difficulties for a lot of people is a trigger, right? I truly believe that after this health pandemic, we're gonna see a wave of mental health issues based off of the symptomology that it was caused by the disparities by the health pandemic, right? And so we gotta kind of make sure that we're hitting on these spots as we're dealing with clients. But number one, mental health. Number two, financial difficulties. For children, there's also this concept of bullying that is happening. It's a really harsh reality in their life. Relationship troubles. We have academic and school troubles, legal problems. I mean, you name it. There really is nothing about the human experience that cannot potentially be a hindrance in someone else's mental health, right? Or their health in general. Is there anything else that y'all can think about that can be added to this list? In your experience, in your opinion, what other things can potentially drive someone to consider suicide?
Not having any stability, maybe moving homes constantly, not being able to go back to, your first home.
So a loss of home. For many children, that's their identity, right? It's a loss of identity. Anything else?
I mean, it's to organs too, but the fear of the unknown, like, are you gonna go home or are you not? Are you gonna go from this, the next placement to be worse than the one that I was just in? Abandonment.
Bingo. Yeah. Abandonment is a big issue with children and then also adults.
Oh, this is a great one. One of our volunteers said poor physical health.
And so, earlier I pointed to the concept of building rapport with your clients. And for us to shift the paradigm of learning these textbook versions of suicide, right? It's not just mental health. It's all these other issues, these real life issues. The fear of abandonment, the experience of legit abandonment. I mean, it's not just the fear. There's certain clients that have literally been abandoned at their most vulnerable time, right? And so we got to think about these things. So true or false, most suicides involve drugs or alcohol. This is true. About 70% include some type of form of drugs or alcohol, right? The severity of drug and alcohol is kind of everywhere, from weed to some of the worst, right? Talking about suicide can plant the idea in someone's head. That is completely false. That is completely false. Most people feeling suicide want to talk about their feelings. Teenagers have the highest rate of suicide. That is also false. The highest risk population is between 45 and 54. So I hear some gas. Are you surprised by that?
Midlife crisis.
Midlife crisis, yeah.
But it's my uncle died by suicide a couple of years ago. He was 74.
Yeah.
And so it shocked everybody that he was diagnosed with terminal illness.
Yeah.
And, he like that. That decision at 74 years old.
Before I got into the counseling field, I was a director for a homeless shelter in Corpus, and I had some clients that it was a pair of siblings, and they came from a pretty well background. I mean, it seemed like they were financially stable. They were in college, but their mother became involved with a man who was suffering from addiction, and so she ended up becoming an addict herself. They traveled from California down to Texas And I guess her children, who were in their teens, became too much for them. She completely abandoned them. Just completely abandoned them. From one day to the next, these siblings were homeless. And they became clients of the shelter that I was a director at. And I did my background. I mean, I tried getting in contact with their family in California. I tried finding out, what school they went to, and apparently, the mom just completely screwed them over. And as these kids were experiencing homelessness, I literally saw their mental health deteriorate. Like it was so sad to see, and it was phenomenal at the same time because I had never seen that. And literally it took a month from being what I considered a pretty healthy set of siblings to life happening to them. And it was just phenomenal. So at the end of the month, they were showing signs of suicidal ideation. And one attempted the month after that. Luckily, he survived the attempt, but it was just incredible. So what I learned from that was that any one of us are a shift away from our life completely changing. And so we have to, I tell you that story to remind you to, as you're conceptualizing your cases, to think about that. Well, if this child was abandoned, how different was their life before, right? How different is their life now compared to what it was? Or has this child ever had a solid parent in their life? So think about all those things, because those variables have a lot to do with the way they view life, whether they even value their life, right? Any comments, questions? I tend to get off topic, but I'm feeling the most common suicide method is pills. That's completely false. The most common method overall is hanging. So you would think that it would be having some type of, like a gun, right? I think a lot of people have access to that, but hanging, unfortunately, is the most common. The most suicidal people leave notes. That's completely false. About 30% of suicides include some type of notes. Suicide people want to die. That's the misconception. That is completely false. Most suicidal people don't want to die, but want the pain to stop. So some other risk factors is substance abuse, physical illness, grief. Grief is a really big one. Identifying as a minority, including LGBTQ, any type of minority identification, there could be some type of risk. Being a military veteran, you'll see that a lot of military vets have suicidal ideation. And then some people have profound humiliation or failure, right? So that reminds me of like the CEO that loses their business, right? And they have to, so that type of failure, a really drastic failure, can cause someone to be suicidal. So some warning signs. There are some clues, right? There are some clues to suicidal crises. Let's go over some. So some warning signs, it's sudden mood changes. We have appetite changes. All of a sudden, someone's not eating when they used to have a pretty healthy appetite. Talking about life in the past tense, right? Sometimes we'll have clients that kind of talk about, they'll just kind of refer to themselves in the past tense, and it'll be very off-putting, but that's a sign that they're perhaps thinking about ending their life. Telling people goodbye all of a sudden, right? You'll see this in children a lot, where they'll just kind of start, just hugging their teachers and start saying goodbye, and it's just, you think that they're just being children, but in reality, they're saying goodbye to people that they care about. Talking about suicidal acts, feeling hopeless or helpless, and then making lethal statements, like end of life statements. Things like, if I wasn't alive, I wouldn't have to deal with this. Things like that. Statements. Any comments and questions?
Yeah, I think now it's not a fair, when they start giving their personal possessions away.
It's like they're preparing.
If they're close to them, they'll start giving it to the best friends, whatever. That's not them. So, you know, it's a one sign something's going on.
Yeah. That's a really good point. So another sign would be giving away your belongings or things that you care about. Absolutely. So how to help, and I'm gonna go ahead and end with this, and then I know we're at the end of the time, but I'm gonna go ahead and ask, if you wanna ask some questions, we definitely can do that. The number one thing we could do is listen and be empathetic, right? We may not know how it feels like to be suicidal or to have suicidal ideation, but to be empathetic, to understand that the person in front of me that's telling me their narrative is going through something. They're going through something really painful, and they feel like the only way out is to end their life, right? So having empathy can go a long way. Having a list of resources, like hands-on, I carry a resource list in my pocket. Sometimes I carry cards. If I feel like someone needs it, I'll give them the number to a hotline or a website, or I'll have them connect with me with Boundaries. And then explore options, right? So you guys are in the business of prevention, right? So teaching someone how to cope better with life is key. That's a key element. And then we have building a better network, right? Remember, as case managers, it's not just all your responsibility. That's why we have systems like integrative care, right? So it's not just solely one person's job to make sure that someone is healthy. There's other people involved. You might have a client that has a counselor. They might have a counselor and a psychiatrist. They might have another case manager involved. They might have a doctor. They might have a teacher. It really truly does take a village. And so remember that as you're talking to clients. Supportive networks have 3 levels: internal, external, and peripheral. Our internal supports are the things that we do ourselves, right? So internal supports are the actual techniques that we have within ourselves. Then we have, so some techniques of the internal supports is, you know, things like journaling, things like taking walks, prayer for some people, art, yoga, all of the mental health, all of the mental wellness techniques that we all know. Then we have external, so people in our inner circle, right? Our external supports are family, friends, sometimes pets, right? So in your mind, I want you to envision the internal support, what I could do, the external, the people around me, and then we have the peripheral, which is the community resources, which are you guys. You guys are in the peripheral resources for people. So here are some supports for the peripheral support. Some examples: the distress lines, right? The suicide prevention line. We have family doctors, psychiatrists, we have counselors, we have case managers. For some people, even clergy. And so this is pretty important to keep in mind. So just a brief summary: suicide is usually preventable. I know for some people, for clients that are have the ideology for suicide, to them it doesn't feel like there's another way to get better, but there truly is. Suicide can be preventable. Another thing is that asking about suicide thoughts is the most important thing you can do. Just opening up that discussion. If at the end of the day, you just do that, you open up the discussion, then you're already helping a person. It may not be you that provides the actual services for someone to get better, but if someone shares with you and they feel comfortable with you to talk about it, then perhaps you can be inspired to get the resources in line for them, right? So that's it for the presentation. If we could maybe turn on the lights, and then we'll maybe just ask some more questions, and then we'll kind of go from there. So any comments and questions about the topic of suicide? Any experiences that you want to share? Yes, ma'am.
You have someone that's been telling you that they have suicidal ideation. Listen, continue to listen, provided resources, which they don't want, counsel, they don't want to take resources. What's next? I mean, other than this has gone for a couple of years now, 3 years actually. Is it a third time when you think they just Is there a time that you should just say we won't do this attention seeking? Or is that all the out of the picture? You need to continue with this? But this is years and years and they just refuse to, but they know I listen, so I don't know if that's just. Maybe that's just it, that I keep listening.
For some people, some people have discovered that if they talk about something in a specific way, that they get connection with someone. And so it's not necessarily attention seeking, because they're probably not saying that. Like if they go to Walmart and they're talking to a cashier, they're not gonna just say, oh, by the way, I'm suicidal. That technically would be attention seeking because they don't have any connection with that person. But if they're talking to their case manager, for example, or a volunteer or a caseworker, then what it means is that they probably need a different way of expressing themselves. You know, if they're not attempting suicide or they're not self-harming, then they're not suicidal. And so then, you know, you're gonna have to kind of craft the conversation with them in a specific way, but again, it goes back to the assessment. That's why I think that assessment piece is pretty important, because if someone is talking about, if someone is not really talking about suicide on a consistent basis and they haven't tried or they haven't attempted suicide or they're not self-harming, then they're not suicidal. They just have.
Like connection seeking.
I hate that. I don't like the word seeking for some reason, but so let's kind of brainstorm. Connection is a really good word. So perhaps they're yearning connection. How about that? They're yearning a deeper connection with someone. And so how is that sitting with everyone?
That could be abandonment, like finding who in their connections.
And so that reminds me, there are some parents, right? I'm sure y'all have had clients or cases where children come from pretty unsettling backgrounds, right? They've been raised. You know, I heard a mom at a school one time be very upset at their child, and the mom said, "I hope you effing kill yourself." You know, and so the child received. I was completely floored by it. I had never been spoken to that way. My mom has never said that to me. But what I noticed was that the child didn't even bat an eye. The child did not react at all, which tells you what? They've been hearing that for a while, right? So imagine a child like that who grows up to have a case manager, for example, and starts talking like that. We're gonna think that they're attention seeking, but in reality, it might just be their language. That's what they grew up with. Our job is to teach them how to talk, right? So one thing that you could do with your client is, with your case, is to start offering different ways of speaking. Is, okay, well, when you say this, what do you mean? Right? And sometimes you can question, you know, I hear, and this is where the assessment comes into play. This is where the fear of talking about suicide comes into play. If I had a client that was consistently talking about suicide, I would actually challenge the client, and I'm not telling you to do this. Again, I'm telling you, rely on other people, right? It's not just you. I would challenge a client and actually ask them, you know, you talk a lot about death, but I don't really see in your history any suicidal attempts. Why do you talk that way? Let's talk about that. But of course, I'm trained to have those discussions. So do you see where I'm getting at? It's really about building the rapport, and then perhaps offering new ways of having discussions, right?
Yeah, because talking about death doesn't always mean you think about suicide. Exactly. You know, it's understanding about something that you're curious about, and a lot of people don't like to talk about that because it's uncomfortable. Getting back to, like, when you say talking about suicide, I've always felt when you work at level, whatever, when you start to put that particular issue into action, or all of a sudden you start talking about it, at what point in time, what's going on in that person's life that make them all of a sudden start that, whatever. So we're gonna do any intervention, we need to catch that. Okay, what got them started? It didn't just happen overnight. So what is going on in that person's life that I don't know about, or it's pushing them that way, or an issue if they can't handle, it's got them depressed. So if I can address that issue, then I can almost cut that train of thought that you get so depressed that you feel there's no way out. There's nobody cares or whatever it is, that we can help you address that issue.
It's really a cultural, there's a whole other element to the talk about suicide and death. Because, I mean, there's classes out there that are taught about the concept of life and death, right? So one variable that I'm gonna kind of throw out there for you to think about is also the cultural meaning of what death is, right? So I'm sure you have lost someone, and at the funeral, someone has said, they're at a better place. They're at a better place, which for a child, what type of message are we sending to the child that's listening? Is, oh, if I want to be at a better place, then perhaps dying is the key, right? So we also have to think about the social aspects of what death means. So for example, when I have a client that talks about that, I'm sensing that they are considering suicide or they have suicidal ideation, I almost immediately try to define what death means to them. What's the connection of death to them? So that might be out of the scope of your work. I don't want you to go and all of a sudden have these death discussions with your clients or with your cases, your children. But think about if you have, for example, if you have a child that comes from a different cultural background than you, then that might be something to consider is, well, what does this mean to you? What is harm? So yeah, so did that help a little bit? I'm getting you to think. Yes, yes, ma'am.
His suicide assessment you're talking about, is that something that we should do as volunteers with training, or would we just refer them to a therapist?
I think there are, yes, there's some basic assessment tenets. So maybe I could get with Tim and we could figure something out. There are some basic assessment, just some basic questions that you could ask. And it's backed up by research that this is a standard way of assessing whether someone is suicidal or not, that you would get trained in, yeah. And it's basically a 3-level assessment where if a person is at level 3, that means they need urgent care right now.
I have a couple of notes from the chat. We have one volunteer that says we give attention seeking a negative connotation that doesn't deserve. And another volunteer says could be battling the thought in their head and they need to hear reassurance that they're needed.
Yeah, regarding the attention seeking comment, I agree. I agree with that. There is this negative perception of attention seeking because there are some, what I argue is that the concept of attention seeking shouldn't be connected to suicidal ideation. Attention seeking is also a natural thing that children do, right? So if a child is not getting the attention of their mother, what are they going to do? They're going to act in ways to get that attention, which could be healthy. It's healthy, right? But in terms of addressing suicide, there's so much more than just attention seeking. There's this piece of connection that people are missing. There's this piece of abandonment that they're feeling. So all I'm saying is that the term attention seeking, it's not the most productive for the type of work that we need to do with suicide. Right? What was the other one?
Could be that they were battling the thought in their head and they need to hear reassurance that they're
And that goes with the rapport building, connecting.
we also had someone said, thanks for the info, very helpful to learn better language to use to identify without label. And then one thing I was thinking about is you mentioned, grief is one of the causes that we can have some of these things. And I was thinking about, especially if they have dealt with someone who has lost someone that has died by suicide. One of the things that was really interesting to me to learn in my journey is that there's suicide survivors. When you hear that, you think that is someone who attempted suicide and survived, when that's actually someone who is a loved one or someone who has lost someone to suicide. So there are actually some really good groups, like even on Facebook, that you could join and talk with these people. I thought that was something really neat, that because you hear that and you don't think that's what that means, but if you've lost someone in any sense of the way, you're a survivor in that. I think that's
Absolutely. there's also concepts like survival guilt.
Yeah.
where, and you see this a lot with pairs of friends where they make a pact that they're gonna attempt suicide and die by suicide. And one doesn't complete the suicide, then there's a concept of survival guilt. Yeah. So this could be a really heavy topic, right? Suicide is a pretty heavy topic, but I kind of just want to end it on if I may, try to inspire you to think that this is a concept that has been going on even before you decided to enter this profession as a volunteer, right? This has been a part of life to a certain degree. And so what you're doing now, being receptive to learning, shifting those paradigms in your brain, it to me demonstrates your commitment to the community. And so we need more people. We need more people like you out there. I think the world will be a better place if we have more people like you. So I really hope that you leave today with a little bit more of a spark. If you're not battling suicidal ideation yourself, to realize what a great gift that is, right? And if you have the gift, share it with others. And so thank you so much for having me. I hope that this is not our last time to come and present to you. And I'll give you my contact information, and you can share it with everyone. And please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll help you as best as I can. We're all in this together. Thank you.